Hey, Jaden.
Oh my gosh, this intro.
How's it going today?
Yeah, it's going good.
Day 2 of
We're not
SF?
doing one of these, right? We're just going to go back into like...
Yeah, we're going to talk about what you were going to talk about. So, Jaden, you found something really interesting today. Tell me about it.
Yeah, it's a new open source library dropped some contracts that let you keep track of a IPFS hash over all the data your smart contract has emitted. So instead of emitting events that get put into the event tree in each block and then having to sync over all the Ethereum blocks in order to get the data for just your smart contract. This essentially gives you your own tree of data that's anybody can pin on IPFS, and anybody can look up the most recent state of the data and then work their way back to the initial state and sync up essentially the data from that particular smart contract just by talking to IPFS without having to talk to an RPC node.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. I may be wrong, but you're saying, so IPFS is usually used to pin images, correct?
We're using it to pin images. It's used to pin anything you want.
Oh, it could be anything, but mostly like a content type.
Anything,
right.
Any binary content.
Any binary content. Is this the first time, is what you're saying is the ability to pin a Merkle tree that references different states? Is that what you're describing here? Or you're, like, are you pinning a Merkle tree that does et cetera, et cetera?
The neat idea here, we've explored this idea quite a bit ourselves, which is, what if you could use smart contracts to calculate IPFS hashes? And then the smart contract itself could be the source of truth of the IPFS hash, instead of having to generate the hash on the client and then post it on chain. But if the smart contract was able to calculate the IPFS hashes itself, and then it can be the source of truth. If you want to look up the hash, just look on chain instead of having to having the data calculated off chain and then putting on chain. That's the interesting part of it. We've looked at it in terms of how can you have permanent photos, right? If you chop a photo up into a bunch of small slices and each one of those slices is posted on chain, could you have a smart contract that stitches all those slices together into an IPFS hash so that you have the data available both as slices on chain that can be compiled and as a full off-chain binary that can be fetchable with IPFS. So we've done some exploration and research there, but I think there's kind of been a couple of projects that have looked into the other ways that you can apply smart contracts generating IPFS hashes. And this is one of them, right? So what if instead of emitting events or alongside emitting events, you also used a kind of Merkle tree structure that you can fit into the context of IPFS. And so the smart contract is the source of truth of like what's the most recent IPFS hash for all the data that's happened on the smart contract. And then anybody, without needing to dig through all of the Ethereum specific things, right? Dig through all the block data, verify the block hashes, verify the log trees and inclusion of the logs. Instead of having to go through all of that data, which is a lot, if you're on a chain where there's a lot of applications, you just go through a much smaller Merkle tree that has only the data from your application that's hostable on IPFS. And even if it's not posted on IPFS, the neat part of this is, even if nobody pins this data on IPFS, you can always fall back to just indexing the chain and going back in time. And you'll get all the same data if you index the logs normally as you would if you can just get it from IPFS. But because it's IPFS addressed from the get-go, it means that if somebody is pinning it, you have a really nice optimization of your indexing. Instead of having to go through all the indexing on chain, if somebody's pinning it, you get really fast indexing, or fast comparatively. So that's the idea behind this library that dropped
What's the
4
library
days
called?
ago. It's called CID Accumulators by a guy named Austin Williams.
Shout out to Austin Williams.
Oh my gosh.
Have we ever met him?
No,
No, interesting.
don't know this person.
Well, I wanted
came across my GitHub.
I wanted us to rewind a little bit more because we've been talking a lot about social networks, and when you break down the different layers of a social network, at least for us, we kind of came up with 8 different layers, from the identity to storage, indexing, the core actions or actions, and then there's privacy, moderation, the interface or like the app, and then lastly is incentives or the economics of things. So obviously, like, it seems like we're talking about storage and indexing with this new way of writing a smart contract or using this open source library. Like, does it target the storage element, or does it target the indexing, or it's both?
Primarily the indexing, because when you're, in our case, we have all of the events that happen inside of perma emitted as blockchain events. And so each one of those events is kind of a point in time about something happening, but you still need to come up with what's the global state of perma, right? What are all the photos that have been taken? What are all the actions that each user has been taken? And that aggregation of all of this data into something that could be consumable by the app is the indexing layer, or the aggregation layer. And so we currently do that with an indexer, but there's other interesting ways that you could do that as well. So this is primarily at the indexing level.
Right.
Storage is also potentially a thing. In our case, we're also storing the logs of everything that's happened, because we get to take advantage of Ethereum states. And so as long as people are storing the Ethereum blocks, they're storing the state of all the actions. But there's also a separate type of storage, because if we just store the stuff that we're storing in Ethereum blocks, we'll know all about what happened and where and which tokens.
Right.
But we won't necessarily have the actual content, the photos, the kind of meat and potatoes of it, the media that's being stored.
Can you have a social network that has solved the indexing but not storage? Or like if the actual content type is not visible or is not retrievable, but like everything else, like people liking it, people sharing it, the profiles, like that's the other part of a social. It's the two parts, which is the content plus the profile plus all the actions, right? That's what makes up like what a user sees, correct?
Yeah, of course you can split those up. You can have the heavy content, media content off, or long text off chain because it's too expensive. But the small content, the interactions, the profiles, the kind of small bits of data about what happened and when can be put on chain. And that's essentially what we're doing right now, where content is stored off chain in IPFS and pointed to by on chain references.
Right.
But I think as we explore what can we do with storage and where can we store things and how can we make storage more permanent and more fit the use case that we're going for, there's different ways that we can look at storage. But yeah, like right now we split them up. So of course you can split them up.
And one thing that's been so interesting is just rewinding the clock and looking at examples of other social networks like Reddit and Twitter pre-X, and like what does, something like those two social networks have a lot of information, right? A lot of contextual information that needs to be retrieved. In the centralized social networks, they have like an API access, right? Or they have a database that stores all these events, and then they have an API that other people can allow devs to call into, right? Sometimes it's been used, like you were saying, was it Apollo and TweetDeck were great examples of like them leveraging the API to pull information. And what do you think happens when all of that, like the API or even the database that's storing all these things, like who ultimately pays the bills for those services? It must be the company, right?
Yeah.
And what's the issue with Reddit, the company, paying for, I don't know if they use AWS or Google Cloud, but like what's the issue with them paying for all of those services?
I think it depends on your perspective. If you're a user of the app and you enjoy it every day, there is no issue, right? You get what you want, which is an app you can use, and they get what they want, which is eyeballs that they can feed to ads, and everybody's kind of happy. But the question becomes, what happens when that changes? When what you want to experience as a user is no longer what the platform is providing? And I think you can look at Reddit as a use case of this, right? People really loved the Apollo app, which was built by one guy on Reddit's open API. And people loved it. It was a cleaner experience. It had a lot of features that people really wanted Reddit to implement that they didn't. And it was kind of a cult favorite among people who really enjoyed the network that is Reddit, right? And enjoyed interacting with that world, but enjoyed the app layer view that they got from Apollo. And so because you have one entity in control of who's allowed to access the API, what ways are it structured. Eventually, that was taken away, and Reddit said, hey, we're going to limit our API, and so individual apps like Apollo are no longer going to be feasible. And that caused the maintainer of Apollo to no longer support it, because it was no longer a feasible thing for just one guy to do as a business. And so,
But what's the issue with multiple clients or interfaces of a stash of data, in this case, like Reddit? Like, why can't Reddit or Twitter or other social networks, IG, have like 10, 50, 100 different apps out there, not created by them, where the user has the choice to decide how, like, a photo is shown to them, and how to interact is ultimately up to the users and the developers who's building that. Why is that an issue, or why is it that these companies do not like that?
I don't think it's that they don't like it. It's just that the incentive alignment isn't there. If you offer this API as a means to sell ads, and a third-party app shows the content but not the ads, so you're making no revenue from it. Even if people love it, if you are looking at it through just a revenue-narrowed lens, and the only valuable thing we're creating here is ad revenue, then it's not very incentive aligned, right? To have other clients that can choose what they want to do, or can still show ads but take the revenue from your core app. And so I think when you want to focus on a centralized company's ad revenue, then it leads you to make decisions to optimize for that rather than optimizing what people really care about, right? Because if you were optimizing for what users of Reddit cared about in the Apollo case, they would have tried to figure out, how can we make Apollo really great, and how can we make it so that Apollo's success actually raises our own bottom line? How can we align those incentives rather than having them be misaligned? I think that's really tough in the ad model that's based on having all of the eyeballs in one place that you control, that you can kind of force things onto people. So there's nothing inherently stopping a company that's benevolent from opening up their API to multiple clients to build as they see fit, and seeing that as a way to do it, and maybe even solving the incentive problem. I think that's very possible. But it's very difficult to do that without also giving that same centralized entity the ability to pull the plug at any point. There's always that ability to go back on what was said. And I think one of the things we think about a lot with the design of perma is, how do we remove that ability from ourselves? How can we build something where we don't have a plug that we can pull?
It sounds like the true moat or defensibility of a social network or social media platform is both in the data that they accumulate, and then the interface that they own. And in both sides, they could kind of, by owning the interface, they own the attention. They have a singular feed, of which then they can serve ads in the middle of between, like, what the user wants to do, which is look at content. And then owning that data, they can sell more targeted ads, right? Because without that, if they didn't collect the data, or they didn't have all that information, then an advertiser or brand wouldn't have a lot of control around, like, oh, I want to target these people in this region, and in this age bracket, and this psychographic, etc., right? Or this type of interest, right? So both of them kind of create one of the most powerful business model that we've seen in the last several decades, right? But that being said, there is a new wave of social networks, or however you want to call it, where they have open source indexers, right? So in that case, they are doing what we were saying that it would be difficult for a centralized company to do. They allow everyone to access the data freely, and then build your own client if you want, right? And in those models, like, can you talk a little bit more about, what is the pros and cons of this? Isn't this solving that main pain point of allowing anyone to access the data? There's no more API in this case, right?
Well, there still is. There's always something that the app is interfacing with. But I think the big shift is, instead of one company running the infrastructure and nobody else being able to run it, nobody being able to replicate it, nobody being able to have their own kind of spun up instance of Reddit running on their server that they want to talk to, where they'll always have the API as long as they're running it. The new wave of decentralized social apps says that, okay, well, instead of having all of this running on one big server that our company runs, let's make it so that anybody can run a server. And these servers can talk to each other and they can share data. And as long as everybody has the ability to run a server, we get rid of the situation where one company can just pull the plug.
Right.
And one individual can say, no, actually, we want to focus on the bottom line, so we're cutting off API access to third-party clients. So by going from one backend or one index or one relay or one aggregator, one place where all the data is, to many places where you can split up the storage or have the same storage replicated, you give the ability to people who want to run alternative clients or people who want to run their own servers to do so. And that removes that kind of central party in the middle.
And in that case, why isn't everyone running an open source indexer? Like, it sounds great. It sounds like, I would imagine like for Reddit, let's say they pay $100,000 a month for servers, maybe more, I made up that number. Like, it's as if Reddit was like, hey guys, one click, you could launch a copy of all of the data that we have, the same data, except you got to pay the 100K on your own, right, to sustain a copy of all this information because there's so much. Like, is that same, like, in terms of like incentives and payments, like, because we have open source indexers, like, does that problem of who pays for the actual bare metal, the servers, is that still a problem or is that resolved?
I mean, it depends on how much it costs, right? It'll always be a kind of cost optimization problem. And if it costs a lot of money to run, then there's going to be a very small number of people who are willing to eat those costs because they either have a lot of disposable income and they don't care about cost, or the costs is part of their ability to make more money on top of those costs. And so most of the models that we've seen on the decentralized side don't take a strong stance on how are the incentives going to be structured here? How can we make sure that the network is such that it's always going to be possible to run a full node at a reasonable cost? Or some networks make the distinction between full nodes and not full nodes, right? Where some really big, expensive, beefy computers store everything on the network. And if you're just an individual and want to run your own, you run a much smaller one that only stores your data.
Right.
It keeps your data online. And so I think that's one way to solve the trade-off. But at the end of the day, somebody still needs to run a full node, right? There always needs to be somebody indexing the entire network. And the question becomes, who does that? And what are their incentives for doing so? And what's preventing them from being the only one running a full node? Which just gets us back to the situation where one company can change the state of things.
When we talk about decentralized social networks, I think it's important to differentiate that not all decentralized social networks are have crypto rails or one source of truth, right? I think there are several that are out there, from like Farcaster to Bluesky to Lens, and is Mastodon considered decentralized as well, right? Like, and each one of them have varying levels of, or different techniques or different makeups of the architecture. And I think specifically for what we've been exploring is that it's important to have a central source of truth. And that's what the blockchain does really well, right? And like a full node in the context of Ethereum, like how big is a full node? Like
terabytes of data.
Terabytes of data. So if the same question is explored where, creating a full node on the Ethereum network is terabytes of data, that's costly to operate and to run, right? Why do people run full nodes on Ethereum?
Because there's incentives built in. Right? If you run a full node, you can be validating as well. So you can use that data to provide security to the network and get rewards as a part of that. Many people use Ethereum as a baseline for their business. So their business is making money elsewhere. So the costs of running a node are not very much compared to the amount of money their business is bringing in from using Ethereum. And then others just resell the services. You can run a node at a certain fixed cost and then sell access to somebody else who's running a business on Ethereum fixed cost plus plus and pocket the difference. So
Mhm.
because there's some incentives built in, from the incentives of validators and staking to the incentives of businesses who are deeply ingrained into Ethereum and need access to that data
Right.
in order for their already profitable business to run, to people who are just using this as a way to act as service providers. There's some inherent built-in incentive models. And I think beyond just I think leaving the service provider one aside, because you basically have that in any decentralized network where it's possible to run a full node. I think the validator and the business on top of Ethereum are much more interesting, where there's real ways that the data there is inherently valuable, and providing access to that data has built-in incentives to help you do it.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about an analogy of like an Uber driver, right? An Uber driver makes money when they drive somebody, right? I think the latest stats or numbers is they take 70% of each trip. So if it's $10, they make $7, and then Uber, the platform, takes $3. But there's additional costs that are associated with an Uber driver, aka paying for gas, right? Or paying for charging for their electric cars, which whittles down that $7 to maybe, I don't know, $4 or $5, right? And then you also need to pay for insurance and all these things. So it kind of leaves you with very thin margins. But at the end of the day, you know, the reason why, like in this analogy, like Uber drivers, there's so many of them, is that it's still at the end of the day profitable, right? To be an Uber driver, you still can make money doing it. Not as much. You may have to increase the volume of trips that you give, or now you got to work longer hours or drive longer distances, but it's still possible, right? And it speaks to why it's so important to have economic considerations, right? Where like the cost of servers, the cost of electricity, bare metal, etc., have to be offset by the incentives you receive, right? In the case of Ethereum, running a full node costs X amount, and the hopefully validating and receiving the rewards can be greater than the cost you're spending, right? Because if it's below, like you're spending more to run a full node and you get very little rewards, I mean, eventually people aren't going to do it, right? Like, and I think it speaks to why incentives are so important, right? Just being able to, hey, you can replicate our database, our server, or we have an open source indexer, is a great first step, a great first step. But like, if you don't consider like, well, is it important that in the future that there are hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of people running a full node or keeping a copy or maintaining a copy of all this information? Is it truly decentralized? And as the network grows to millions and billions of users, there's expectation, there's more data to store, and therefore cost keeps going. And if one day running a full node costs you $10 a month, and in 3 years it now costs you $100,000 to run, you could bet that number of nodes are going to drop, right? Like people are not, unless the rewards are paying them $200K a month, they're not going to do it, right? And so I think that is the crux of a lot of things that we've been thinking about, right? Like decentralization without incentives, is it really decentralized, right? Like, or is it progressively going to become centralized where the company ends up forking the bill, paying the bill, and sure, anyone can fork it and create their own indexer, but why would they, you know, unless there's incentives, right? Is that correct to how we're thinking about perma?
Yeah, I wouldn't say things are not decentralized because they lack incentives, but I think there's always going to be, unless there's incentives built into the way that we design decentralized systems, there's always going to be kind of this natural centralizing force over time, whether that's the fact that full nodes get really big, right, whether that's the fact that one company has all the developers who work on this one particular project and can just arbitrarily sway the roadmap of the node software, or whether it's, you know, kind of an echo chamber of all of the people who run the software believe the same thing. And you know, that view can change over time as beliefs change, right? Unless there's incentives built in to the network, there will be a lot of, in any decentralized network, there's always pressure to re-centralize.
Right.
And the way that you can prevent against that is you can align the incentives such that the most rational, selfish thing you can do, if you're just a selfish actor trying to maximally extract profit from this, the most rational thing you can do is actually the thing that keeps the network decentralized. Rather than if you're a selfish, profit extracting actor, your optimum strategy is actually to re-centralize the network. And that's the incentive problem, right?
So what you're saying is like, we expect people to be pessimistic or bad actors.
Yeah.
We start from there, and everyone's in that state of like rent seeking and like watching out for themselves.
Yeah.
And how do we design a decentralized social network where, you know, the more bad actors you get, it actually becomes more decentralized, right? Like, it don't be evil, like, hey, actually be evil, but in the sense that if you do it, like, the more rent-seeking you are, the more decentralized the network gets.
Oh, right, and I wouldn't say rent-seeking is evil, right? I would just say it's selfish, right? Being evil would be to do something that counteracts the rules of the protocol, right? It would be to try and spend money twice in most cryptocurrency networks. That's like bad actors.
Right.
But it's not a bad actor to try and extract the maximum amount of money from your validator node, right? That's why MEV exists, right? Maximum extractable value.
Are people who perform MEV good or bad for a blockchain?
It depends on the incentives, right? It's neutral. It's selfish, right? It's rent-seeking. It's maximally extractive.
Right.
That's not evil, right? Evil would, like the thing that would actually cause things to break, would be violating the rules of the protocol. And assuming you have ways to prevent violation of the rules of the protocol, you can't spend the same money twice.
Right.
That's kind of baked into the rules. As long as you're not doing that, anything on top of that is fair game. It's not bad. It's just extractive. It's just selfish. But good incentive design is when even a maximally selfish person trying to extract the maximal amount of money, the best way that they can do that is by doing the thing that they should have done anyways if they were a good actor. If they were just doing it out of the goodness of their heart, if they were just trying to maximize decentralization.
Right.
That's the incentive alignment problem, right? And in a world where it's really expensive to run a full node, how do we make sure that the best strategy for monetizing a full node or wanting to run a full node is aligned with keeping it decentralized rather than, well, we should just make it really hard to run a node so that we're the only ones who run a node, so that everybody has to come and pay us, right? That's kind of a maximally extractive mindset.
Right.
So making sure the incentives are aligned is really important. And I would say that's kind of the definition of good incentive alignment is people who are maximally selfish, their optimal strategy for achieving the best outcome for them as individuals is actually to do the thing that the system wanted them to do the whole time.
I think that's a key insight that, at least the perspective that we operate under, right? Because right now, if we were to map this, I don't know if you call it a user flow, right? Where you have a centralized company that has a core app, right? Like an interface in the context of decentralized social networks. And then they have users. We can use, for example, AT protocol, bluesky, users, farcaster protocol, warpcast, soon to be farcaster app, and then users. And then regardless of whether it's a relayer or hub or an indexer, they have it open sourced. And similar to what we discussed, like anyone can run a relayer, right, or indexer or hub. And what ends up happening is that they have a lot of developers, right, who they attract because there's users in the app. And then they want these developers to build third-party apps. That could be clients or things inside of the farcaster app, like mini apps or other things. And then there's this third-party services. So talk a little bit more. There's a few examples of third-party services that spin up indexers for devs, right? Why do they exist? Why don't the devs just do it themselves?
Usually it's just a matter of complexity, right? If it's really hard to spin it up yourself, but really easy to fork over some money to somebody to do it for you, and it maybe costs 10% more. If it costs twice the effort to spin it up yourself, but only 10% more in dollar cost, then it's usually a pretty good, you're just applying the kind of profit maximalizing approach, right? Saving twice the effort in exchange for 10% more payment is a good approach, and so that's why service providers can exist. In the case of running your own things, sometimes the data is actually 10 times as valuable to you, right? And so it's worth putting in twice the effort to spin up and maintain a full load, because the output you get is 10 times greater than what you would get from paying the extra 10%.
Right.
So
it kind of makes the dev experience much easier. They can focus on building third-party apps. They use your service to spin up an indexer, right? And I, as a dev, pay you as a third-party service, of which you then spin up more hubs, more indexers, and relays. And then effectively that does create more decentralization, right? There's a lot more hubs, but at the end of the day, what happens of that cycle is developer who's building third-party apps, they're not going to do it for free, right? Maybe in the beginning they did a hackathon, maybe they are banking on like, hey, I'll build third-party apps. There's a lot of users in the main app. Maybe I can monetize off of those users, or latch on to the distribution of those users. Then I can make money as a dev. Then I can pay the third-party service provider, and then the network becomes more decentralized, right? And there's a huge kind of like question in the air of like, can the main app keep growing users? Are those users going to, or are they willing to pay for the main app so they have a willingness to pay? And will those users be actually interested in exploring multiple interfaces or multiple different apps that are in this ecosystem, or will they just stay with the core one, right? And I think like there's a lot of ifs in this kind of like ecosystem diagram of where value flows in and out, and I think like the incentives here are kind of there, but like it's not like what would you say is like what would be an optimization of this if you had any idea?
Yeah, and to be clear, this isn't bad. This is a really natural model, right? Saying that a protocol that has a lot of users will generate a lot of value, and people will want to come and build apps on top of it that makes the protocol more valuable to users, and they can capture some of the value that they create, and the protocol can capture some of the value, and that once that gets to, if that cycle keeps turning, we'll keep creating more and more value inside of this protocol. It's pretty classic network effects. It's not bad by any stretch, but it's not guaranteed that the network is going to create valuable things that will attract devs to begin with, that devs will be able to create more value on top, and that the devs will be able to capture enough value to pay for the services as a whole. And I think there's also kind of, depending on the structure of the protocol and dev relationship, if a dev is creating a lot of value and capturing a lot of value, there's a lot of incentive for the protocol to start capturing that value and say, hey, somebody's making a lot of money on our protocol. Maybe we should get a piece of this pie, right? Maybe we should start capturing this value for the protocol. And so if you don't bake the incentives in from the get-go, and say like, hey, the protocol is only ever going to take 10% of the value created by devs. And it's going to do so in this predefined way, so devs know what they're signing up for up front, and we're not going to change that. We're going to encode that into the rules of the protocol. That's thinking about incentives up front, right? You know what the incentive structure is, you make it so it can't be changed, and then everybody knows what the rules are coming into the game. If that's not there, if incentives aren't thought about from first principles from the beginning of building it, or added on very soon after it's launched, or if there's the ability to change those incentives over time, right? If one or a small group of people can change those incentives arbitrarily, then there's always going to be this tension between developers trying to create value and capture it, and the protocol trying to capture value that's created by itself and by third-party developers. And so if you don't think about incentives from the get-go, you leave this kind of open question of like, who's going to get there first? Are the devs going to make a ton of money by creating a lot of value and capturing a lot of value, or is it going to be this battle between the protocol and kind of the quote-unquote main app, right? The one that carries the same flag as the developers of the protocol, to start capturing some of that value and creating that tension.
What you're saying is like, what if a third-party app becomes more popular than the core app? Like somehow it grows more users because it becomes viral. Like in that case, as the core company, that yes, they have the the core app and the protocol, etc. What would you do if a third-party app is now like 10x your user base and people are paying for that rather than the core app?
I don't think it matters what I would do. I think it matters what is the selfish optimal strategy, right? If you're putting yourself in a position where the selfish optimal strategy is to start taking the value that dev's creating and taking more of it for your protocol, and you have the tools to do so, you're in a very poorly incentivized position, right? Your goodness as a protocol is basically, at that point, we're basically just relying on you being a good person and not choosing to do the selfish thing, right?
What's the selfish thing to do?
The selfish thing would be to take the maximum amount of that value that you can, or at least more than the dev is
Well, you
willing to
can't
give.
shut down that app though, right?
No, but you can redirect the value. Why don't we just build the same feature but in our app?
I see.
That's better and that has the like quote unquote branded version, right? Same brand as the protocol, same brand as the thing. Why don't we add an additional tax on that dev, or on devs as a whole, such that it's still valuable for them, but instead of it being wildly profitable, it's much less, right?
Right.
It's like upping the fee that you charge to Uber drivers, right?
Right.
Uber can do that at their discretion. There's nothing preventing them from doing it. They haven't publicly said we won't do that. They haven't encoded any logic to prevent them from doing that.
Right.
And so the incentive will always be to do the selfish profit maximizing thing. And if you haven't thought about the incentives up front and said this is how we're going to do it, and removed your hands off the steering wheel so you can't control it, then that incentive is always going to be there. You're always going to be incentivized to maximize profits.
Right.
That's not bad. That's just the way things are. And good incentive design is figuring out a way to take your hands off the steering wheel in a way that the car still steers itself. There's still value generated. There's still value captured.
Right.
That value that's captured goes where it's supposed to go, either to the stakeholders in the protocol or the stakeholders in the company that's running the protocol. But the incentives are thought about from the get-go and built in from the get-go. And so it doesn't introduce this like at any point you can pull the plug dynamic.
I mean, I wonder like Apple and Uber and other marketplaces, they certainly have their hand on the steering wheel of incentives, right? They could freely increase from 30 to 40% or decrease it, right? And that is a sense, I guess it's part of the power that they have because of the network they've established. Like, why do you think programmatic incentives are key to this next phase of marketplaces or social networks, etc.? Why does it have to be encoded in code that no singular company or individual, etc., can just dial it up, dial it down? Why is that more valuable in that sense?
Because in that case, if you get rid of one or a small group of people being able to do that, that always comes at the expense of others, right?
Right.
If you're profit maximizing and you have your hand on the steering wheel, you can cut somebody off, right? You can steer into the other lane. That other person gets cut off. Their experience is worse. Your experience is better, and you were able to take value from them at your own expense. If you maintain your hand on the steering wheel metaphorically, and you have the ability to adjust the value that you're going to take, or to change the rules arbitrarily on others, and you have that ability simply because you're the creator of the protocol, or the company bearing a similar name to it, or you have some kind of like soft power, some soft social consensus that you are one with the protocol, then there's always going to be the incentive to do that.
Right.
If you're trying to optimize for the things that you ought to be optimizing for, which is profit maximization. But if you always have the ability to do that, everyone's relying on your good graces to not do that, rather than relying on what they could be relying on, which is you can't do that. Right? It's the classic crypto scene adage of instead of can't be, or instead of don't be evil, it should be can't be evil.
Right.
How can we build systems from the ground up where you actually, even if you wanted to exert all the centralizing pressure in the world, the system would still hold up to it.
I think the key here is it's about users, right? Like the user experience, delivering value to the users, right, of a network. Again, going back to Uber, right? Like if Uber increases 2x's their cut to from 30% to 60%, I mean, that would probably wipe out a lot of drivers, right? A lot of drivers would probably be like, well, the cost of doing this now is no longer profitable, and why am I doing all this work and like I only get 40 and the platform gets 60? And then because let's say the 10 million or 8 million drivers are now reduced to, 3 to 4 million drivers globally, then what that translates to the user is wait times, right? Where the wait times for a user will now double or triple or quadruple. We don't know if it's linear or exponential because there's less drivers out there.
Could be higher costs,
right?
too.
And or the cost goes up, right? Now instead of paying $15 for an Uber trip, it's $30, right? It becomes a bidding war, $50. And so ultimately, I think the users lose here, right? Where they have to wait longer, they have to pay more, and they have to then go for other options for transportations, which might not be as safe or may not be as convenient. And so it's very important that the incentives are balanced because it's not just between the platform or protocol or the developer, it's the users are in the equation here, and they ultimately suffer the decrease of value or the increase of value, right? So in regards to a social network, it's the same principle too, right? The users, the people who use a social network, social media, etc. If it's not decentralized, or if there's not a lot of people running nodes or indexers, they have one central interface. Could you argue that that's fine because that one interface should be the most efficient, the most easiest to use? Or is there actually many parallel universes of multiple third-party apps that explore new ways of interacting with content?
Yeah, I guess I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with one company running one server and one interface for one app, as long as you as a user get what you want. But you as a user take the risk that that might not last forever, and you have no guarantees that will last forever, right? You can run through the list of countless apps that started really great and then got worse and worse and worse as the incentives and the desire for profit maximization were implemented at the expense of users.
Right.
The only way to prevent that is by creating the incentive design up front and creating the means to take your hands off that steering wheel. So that even if you wanted to try and maximize profit, you can only do so subject to the rules of the system.
Right.
And if the rules are designed well and maximize the well-being of end users rather than any one entity trying to profit maximize, and those rules are set in stone, then you have something that can't get worse, right? It can only continue to do what it's meant to do. And if it's poorly designed, it probably won't work very well, right? But if it's well designed, it can last forever.
That's like a country that has tax and other rules already defined, and they define the local maxima and the minimus, and like you go to the country and like, hey, it's never gonna really shift from these values, right? Like it cannot shift from these values.
Well, you just kind of move up the stack, right? What causes the values of a country to remain static? How strong are the institutions? How strong is its constitution? How likely is it to change during the time that you are interacting with it, right? The cool thing that we have access to, because we have the tools to create programmatic incentives, which is the tools that crypto offers us, we have the ability to write things that are set in stone for as long as the institution remains, right? As long as the institution, the kind of like neutral base layer exists, and as long as there are people willing to run a neutral base layer and the incentive design one level up the stack is good, then apps can inherit that same incentive design and build on top of it to build their own incentives. But in the case of a country, you're only as stable as your base layer. You're only as stable as the rule of law and enforcement of property law and enforcement of contracts, et cetera, right? In this case, we have the ability to provide a lot of those enforcements using code without trusting one person.
Right.
Because we have achieved that globally, we have achieved the ability to build applications on top of that. So there's no reason that you need to build applications that have a reliance on the institution of a single company. You can build apps that rely on long-standing institutions that have proven that they're neutral, and institutions that nobody could easily take down.
Right.
We get to kind of inherit those properties, and that gives us the tools to use incentive design, which used to be limited to only building only operating at very high levels, right?
Right.
The only way you can really change tax policy is by changing the institutions of the government, which is very
Or
hard.
elect a new government.
Yeah.
Right.
But now you can change it with code, and you can try something new economically,
Right.
and try some new incentive design, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But you have the tools to create new incentives from the ground up.
Mhm.
And if you create good incentives from the beginning, you can remove a lot of these pressures towards centralizing an application and towards ultimately creating a worse user experience, or at least the potential for a infinitely worse user experience
Right.
going forward.
And I think a common misconception is when people think about decentralized social networks and then they think crypto or blockchain, they think about speculation, right? They think about, oh, this social network, it's about content that's minted and people can buy it or speculate on it, or coins and markets, and value goes up to the chart, right? Like they get this, some people get this shiver of like, oh, this social network is all about making money, right? And sometimes there are valid cases, right, where it's like, hey, there's a bunch of creators make X amount on existing platforms, but they can make way more on these platforms, and so that's already better, right? But the problem with that is like, if you look at it through time, you know, like will these speculative incentives, financial incentives of like making money fast, internet money, will it sustain through the long term, right? While the social network grows, or is it kind of a blip, and then people get really excited, a creator gets paid $1,000, which is great, you know, more than a few dollars from a different platform, but can they keep making regular income, you know, $1,000 a month, you know, or grow it, right? And I think that's kind of the biggest question mark when people think of crypto and social networks. They think about DeFi and all these things. And I think like when we go down this avenue, we're totally not even imagining speculation or DeFi or adding the two letters phi to anything, right? We're thinking it from this kind of first principles about about driving behaviors that are good in our books, that keep the network decentralized, and ultimately give users the value, and have the content that is precious to you hopefully live continuously and hopefully permanent, right? Jaden, what about that? What about this idea of, because right now we have like a central entity, company, platform, protocol, whatever, right? Then you have devs as like a different class of folks, right? And then you have users. Is there a world where it can be simplified, where, you know, maybe the users are the ones operating the nodes? Like maybe we kind of melt down the devs into the user group, where now it's about protocol and users, and just by the simple interaction and usage of it, it actually becomes more decentralized. So, you know, when you have 1 billion users, the network is so decentralized, it's because there's 1 billion nodes, versus like the other way where you have 1 billion users, server costs are expensive, there's less devs that can run it, and then etc. Like, is that possible?
A bit of an open question, I think. But the kind of inherent trade-off there is the more users and the more active those users are, the more data they're generating, the more overhead there is to keep this application or protocol online, right? The harder it is to run a full node, the more users you have. And it's not so much about making it such that, you know, it has to be only on a user's phone. Like it has to be, like there should be no distinction between full nodes and partial nodes. Everybody should run a full node on their phone, and the full node should be so small that that's not a problem, right? There's always this inherent kind of engineering trade-off between running things on the edge and being able to handle large amounts of data. But I think the bigger question is, how do we make sure that the way the network is designed from the get-go is such that when we're faced with the decision of should we make something happen at the client side and do the hard engineering challenge of optimizing data use versus the ability to run on the edge, let's try and run it on the edge. Let's try and run it on the device.
Right.
And if we can't do that, let's try and incentivize people who are not running it on the edge, or who are running it on the edge, to change the constraints, right? Maybe if we incentivize people, they'd be willing to use twice the space on their device, or 10 times the space on their device, rather than just the default. Maybe if we incentivize people, they'd be willing to run a small personal node, or maybe there's companies that will be interested in validating and getting paid for validation. I think there's a number of ways that you can explore this trade-off of everything should be on the client side, everything should be totally peer, right? You can go very far down
Right.
that, and there's projects that have been really cool. Things like Scuttlebutt, right, where there's no servers. You have to be in physical proximity with another device, and they actually communicate the two. There's lots of trade-offs, UX trade-offs with that. But when the centralizing forces, it's a lot easier to just do the centralized approach. Right? It's a lot easier to just say, hey, we'll have some full nodes, and the full nodes are really hefty, but that's fine. Like we'll try and optimize the data. We won't try and optimize anything for it. We'll throw it in the full node. We'll call it a day. So I think it's partially a practice of trying to do the hard thing of making things work on the client side, because doing things on the client is getting more and more and more feasible. We've got a lot better technology to do so. We've got a lot more powerful devices in our pockets.
Right.
We've got a lot better cryptography that we can use that's faster, and ways that we can do things trustlessly between two users, ways we can communicate between two devices. That's always getting better and better and better. And the speed at which that gets better doesn't necessarily get matched by the speed at which applications adopt it.
Right.
And so it is a harder engineering challenge to create a network that could theoretically be run just purely client-side. And I don't know if it's an open question as to whether that's fully possible, right? But
no one has done this.
Well, they have. There's trade-offs, right? You just accept the trade-off, right?
Right.
Something like a Scuttlebutt style, it is, right? It connects over Bluetooth, two phones,
Right.
fully peer-to-peer, and it's all local, right? The only thing that exists as far as you're concerned is what you've synced on your phone. But that comes with trade-offs, right? You can't just pull to refresh when you're not around anybody.
That's true.
It's possible. There's just trade-offs that are unacceptable in a lot of applications.
Right.
And so it's finding a balance between those two trade-offs, and in that balance, finding a way that incentives can be used to mitigate the centralizing forces of those trade-offs.
Yeah, like I could, going back to like the Reddit database, and I'm just using Reddit because it's on the top of my mind, but is what you're saying is this idea that the Reddit database can be saved on every single Reddit user's phone when they have the app in the form of some way, or in some fashion, form or fashion, right? How would that work if the server itself is, or the information is so heavy? How can the tens of millions of users or hundreds of millions of users of Reddit, how can they save all of that information on a phone? Is that one of the main challenges? It's just like how to compress it, or like or do you break it into chunks and then you kind of distribute it to all of the Reddit users so they can put it back together? Like what have you seen in through the research or what's out there?
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the key trade-off, right? If you're storing a couple terabytes, it's not going to fit on your phone, period. No matter how you slice it, no matter how good your
iPhone needs to sell like a 100 terabyte phone or something.
Sure, I mean, and we'll probably get there, right? The cost of storage drops dramatically year over year, but we're not there now. And so will we get to a point where the amount of storage you have locally exceeds the size of a global network? Maybe, but it's kind of an unknown. But yeah, that is the trade-off. If you can't run the entire data sets on a phone, the challenge is not really can you put the data on the phone.
Right.
The challenge is can you give a user a good experience of interacting with the network on a phone. And one solution to that is just put all the data on the phone. But there are many other solutions to that. Like the kind of extreme is all the data is on the phone.
Right.
The other extreme is all the data is on the Reddit server. And it's just kind of a 1 or 0 on either side. But there's a lot of stuff in the middle, right? Yeah. Where you can have all of your personal data stored locally, and then for everything else you fetch it from a local cache, right? Or from a local kind of partial node that you run. You could have things where every user stores a little chunk of it, and if you've got enough users with enough spare data, you can always, and assuming they're online reasonably often, you could ping other users for it. Again, the trade-off there is latency and
Right.
not guaranteed to have data replicated. There's a lot of trade-offs here and a lot of different explorations here. I'm not sure there's one ideal, right? There's a lot of tools you can pull from to try and create a network where even without one central authority leading it with its hand on the steering wheel, it can still continue to function. And I think that's what we're in progress of exploring. Is what is that trade-off that makes sense, right?
Yes.
What is that trade-off that we can
And
find?
the incentives.
Yeah, and how can we use incentives as a tool to open up the exploration space of trade-offs that are feasible, right?
Right.
If a lot of kind of areas of trade-offs tend to be slippery slopes towards centralization and tend to have incentives that push towards centralization.
Like the gravity is normally, it's pulling it down no matter what.
If you think about it like a slope or like a gravity well, like the gravity of centralization is very heavy, right?
Right.
You're always going to face
you're
always going to face the uphill climb towards
Right.
fully on user devices, fully client side, fully whatever, because
Right.
it's always going to be easier to do better UX when you come there. It's always going to be a force towards centralization. But can you tip the scales by adding in incentives? Can you tip the scales by writing incentives that mitigate that kind of gravitational force and actually push the force in the opposite direction, where you're better off as a rational actor to try and optimize for fully decentralized, try and optimize for acting in that way. So it's an open question. I don't think anyone's solved yet. There's no trade-off that's ever solved. There's just different tools and different trade-offs to make and different ways that the technology we have affects the range of possible trade-offs that fall into that window of acceptable UX, acceptable user experience. And in our case, acceptable user experience that won't change and become worse.
Right. Well, I think that is a good wrap-up point for day 2, and I think we dove into a lot of incredible topics around indexing, decentralized social networks, incentives to edge computing. So yeah, thank you everyone for watching. We'll have another one tomorrow, and we'll dive into another topic there. So thank you. Bye everyone.